right before your life changes, it starts to feel pointless. That's the moment most people quit. There is a strange moment in every human life, a moment when everything feels like it is falling apart. But nothing is actually wrong. Your energy drops, your motivation fades, your mind becomes heavy, and you start thinking, maybe I'm not meant for this. But what if I told you something dangerous? What if I told you that this exact emotional state, the confusion, the exhaustion, the doubt, is not a sign of failure, but a psychological signal of transformation? What if the breakdown you are experiencing is actually the doorway to becoming someone new? Carl Jung once said, "No tree can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell." And maybe, just maybe, what you are feeling right now is not the end of your story. Maybe it's the beginning of the version of you that can finally make it. Life rarely builds you gently. It does not tap you on the shoulder and politely invite you to become more than you are. It breaks you first. It dismantles what you believe about yourself, about the world, about how things are supposed to work. Carl Jung understood this with uncomfortable clarity. He saw that growth is not a reward for good behavior, not a motivational speech, not a sudden surge of confidence. Growth is frightening because it requires the destruction of something familiar. The mind does not evolve through comfort. It evolves through disintegration, through moments where what once held you together no longer works, and you don't yet know what will replace it. When people imagine transformation, they picture inspiration, they imagine clarity, they imagine a sense of certainty and purpose. But psychologically, transformation begins with confusion, with exhaustion, with a sense that the ground beneath you has disappeared. This is not a flaw in the process. This is the process. Every major shift in a human life begins with collapse. Identity collapses, beliefs collapse, certainty collapses, direction collapses. Not because you failed, but because the version of you that was built to survive yesterday cannot carry the weight of who you are becoming tomorrow. Think about how this shows up in real life. A man loses his job. On the surface, it looks like a financial problem, but the deeper wound is psychological. His sense of usefulness, his place in the world. The story he told himself about who he is suddenly dissolves. He wakes up feeling smaller, uncertain, exposed. A woman leaves a relationship. People see heartbreak, but what they don't see is the loss of emotional safety, the loss of a shared future, the collapse of an identity built around being chosen, being needed, being seen. A student fails an exam or drops out of a path they thought defined them. It looks like an academic setback, but internally it feels like a judgment on their worth, their intelligence, their potential. On the surface, these moments look like loss. Psychologically, they are something much deeper. They are ego death. Jung called this the death of the persona, the mask you wear to function in the world. The persona is the version of you that learned how to be acceptable, how to belong, how to survive expectations. It is not fake, but it is incomplete, and when life demands more from you than this mask can provide, the mask begins to crack. When that happens, the experience is disorienting. You feel empty, lost, unmotivated, disconnected. The things that once excited you no longer work. The goals you chased feel hollow. You start questioning everything, including yourself. This emptiness is terrifying because the mind equates it with nothingness. But psychologically, emptiness is not nothing. It is space. Space where old structures have fallen, but new ones have not yet formed. Space for reconstruction. Space for reconstruction. Space for truth. Space for rebirth. The problem is that most people panic in this space. They rush to fill it with distractions, addictions, or old patterns, because silence feels unbearable when you don't yet trust what is emerging. Jung believed that when life breaks you in this way, it is not punishing you. It is initiating you into a deeper relationship with yourself. But initiation is never comfortable. It demands that you let go of who you thought you were before you are allowed to discover who you actually are. This is where the shadow enters the story. The shadow is one of Jung's most misunderstood ideas, largely because people assume it refers to something dark or immoral. But the shadow is not evil, it is simply the rejected self, the parts of you that did not fit into the image you needed to maintain. The emotions you were told were unacceptable. The desires that felt too much, too intense, too dangerous. Somewhere along the way, you learned that certain parts of you threatened belonging. So you pushed them down. You were told not to feel anger, so you learned to swallow it. You were told not to want too much, so you shrank your ambition. You were told not to question authority, so you silenced your curiosity. You were told not to be selfish, so you abandoned your needs. None of this happened because you were weak. It happened because you were adapting. The shadow is created through survival. But buried energy does not disappear. It does not die quietly. It leaks out sideways. It shows up as anxiety that seems to have no clear cause, as procrastination that makes you feel lazy and ashamed, as self-sabotage where just when things start to work, you do something that pulls you back. It becomes addiction, not because you lack discipline, but because you are trying to regulate emotions you were never taught how to hold. It becomes overthinking, emotional numbness, restlessness, chronic dissatisfaction. People look at themselves in these states and judge. They call themselves broken, unmotivated, flawed. But psychologically, what is happening is internal conflict. One part of you wants safety, approval, predictability. Another part wants expansion, freedom, expression. When these parts are not integrated, they fight. And when they fight, the system freezes. Not because you are weak, but because you are divided. Jung warned that what we refuse to acknowledge within ourselves does not disappear. It gains power in the dark. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. This is not poetic exaggeration. It is a psychological law. When your shadow remains unseen, it expresses itself through patterns you don't understand. You end up repeating the same relationships, the same failures, the same frustrations, and you start to believe life is against you. In reality, your own unintegrated parts are steering the wheel. Facing the shadow does not mean indulging every impulse. It means recognizing what you have disowned and asking why. It means realizing that your anger might be protecting a boundary that was never allowed to exist, that your ambition might be a call toward a life that fits you better, that your hunger for more is not greed, but a sign that your current container is too small. When these parts are acknowledged rather than suppressed, their destructive force transforms into creative energy. This inner confrontation often intensifies right before a breakthrough, which is why so many people feel most stuck when they are actually closest to change. Psychologically, the mind resists transformation not because change is bad, but because the mind values familiar pain more than unfamiliar freedom. Familiar pain is predictable. You know how to survive it. You know who you are inside it. Unfamiliar freedom requires a new identity, and that feels like death to the ego. This is why people remain in toxic relationships long after love has died, why they stay in empty careers that drain their vitality, why they tolerate environments that slowly suffocate them. These situations hurt, but they are known. They provide a sense of psychological continuity. Uncertainty, on the other hand, threatens the structure of the self. Here is the paradox most people never understand. The closer you get to growth, the louder the resistance becomes. Fear intensifies. Doubt grows sharper. Confusion thickens. Fatigue sets in. You start thinking about quitting, going back, numbing out. This is not failure. It is psychological friction. Your old identity is fighting to survive. Like a snake shedding its skin, the process is tight and uncomfortable. The skin does not loosen willingly. It clings. It resists. But the tightness is not death. It is separation. And separation always feels like loss before it feels like freedom. When you reach this stage, your mind will produce convincing arguments to stop. It will remind you of past failures. It will exaggerate risks. It will tell you that you are tired, that you are not ready, that now is not the time. This is not intuition. This is the ego defending its territory. The ego's job is to preserve identity, not to help you grow. growth threatens its control. Jung believed that enduring this tension consciously is what leads to individuation, the process of becoming a whole human being. Individuation is not about becoming perfect or enlightened. It is about becoming integrated, about allowing the different parts of you to exist without one dominating the others. But this integration cannot happen without passing through uncertainty. That is why this phase feels so lonely. Other people may not understand what you are going through. From the outside, it might look like you are stuck, unproductive, or losing momentum. Internally, you are dismantling and rebuilding your inner architecture. That work is invisible, but it is not meaningless. If you are here now feeling blocked, tired, uncertain, it does not mean you are failing. It means something old is no longer viable. It means a structure that once protected you is now limiting you. The discomfort is a signal, not a sentence. A message that says you cannot go forward as the person you have been, but you also cannot go back. This is the threshold. And thresholds are uncomfortable by nature. They are spaces between identities, between stories, between selves. Most people turn back here, not because they lack strength, but because they misinterpret the signals. They think fear means danger when often it means growth. They think exhaustion means incapacity when often it means reorganization. If you can stay present in this moment without numbing it away or rushing to escape it, something shifts. The fear does not disappear overnight, but it loses its authority. The confusion slowly gives way to insight. The fatigue begins to transform into clarity. Not because the world suddenly becomes easy, but because you are no longer fighting the process. What emerges on the other side is not a louder version of your old self. It is a quieter, steadier one. A self that trusts its inner signals more than external validation. A self that understands its shadow instead of being controlled by it. A self that can tolerate uncertainty without collapsing. Life breaks you before it builds you, because breaking is how rigid structures loosen. Because collapse is how false identities dissolve. Because a lapse is how false identities dissolve. Because only what is real survives disintegration, and what survives is not the mask you learn to wear, but the core you were afraid to trust. Got it? What follows is deep, slow Jungian prose, meant to be spoken, not skimmed. Each part is expanded fully, emotionally grounded, with lived human examples. Not academic explanation. This is narration-ready material. Take your time with it. Pause between paragraphs when you read it aloud. Carl Jung noticed something deeply ironic about intelligence. The very thing society praises as protection, clarity, logic, foresight, often becomes the sharpest blade turned inward. The more intelligent the person, the more articulate their despair becomes. They don't collapse dramatically, their despair becomes. They don't collapse dramatically. They don't quit impulsively in a moment of anger or frustration. They quit quietly, respectably, with reasons. They sit alone at night and think. They analyze trends. They calculate probabilities. They examine patterns, past failures, current stagnation, future uncertainty. And slowly, carefully, they build a case against themselves, not because the case is true, but because it is convincing. Intelligent people rarely say, "I'm scared." They say, statistically, this doesn't make sense anymore. They don't say, "I feel inadequate." They say, "I'm being realistic about my limitations." They don't say, "I'm afraid of being seen trying." They say, "I'm afraid of being seen trying." They say, "I'm afraid of being seen trying." They say, "I don't want to waste my life chasing something improbable." This is what Jung meant when he warned that consciousness, when unbalanced, becomes tyrannical. Intelligence, when divorced from courage, does not liberate, it rationalizes retreat. And here is the painful truth: intelligence does not protect you from fear, it refines it. Fear becomes articulate. Fear learns to sound mature. Fear learns to speak in the language of wisdom. The intelligent mind asks, what if I'm delusional? What if this is just ego? What if others are simply more talented? What if this path no longer aligns with who I am? These questions sound responsible. But often they are disguises, because underneath all that sophistication is a very primitive terror, If I continue, I may fail as my true self. Failing while pretending not to care is survivable. Failing after committing your soul is devastating. So the intelligent person creates distance. They detach emotionally. They turn passion into an abstract concept. They observe themselves instead of inhabiting themselves. Jung called this over-identification with the intellect, a state where thinking replaces living. You stop asking, "What wants to be lived through me?" and start asking, "Does this make sense on paper?" But meaning is not born on paper. Meaning is make sense on paper. But meaning is born in risk. This is why many intelligent people become stuck in perpetual preparation, always learning, always refining, always waiting for certainty. But certainty never comes, because certainty never comes, because certainty would require a leap beyond intellect, and intellect resists that leap. So intelligence becomes a beautiful prison, not because it is wrong, but because it is incomplete. And the tragedy is this: highly intelligent people often quit one step before their work would have demanded embodiment rather than explanation. They don't fail, they withdraw, and they call it wisdom. Jung's concept of the shadow is often misunderstood. People think the shadow is only darkness, violence, cruelty, immorality. But Jung knew better. The shadow is not evil. The shadow is everything you had to suppress to survive: your bitterness, your envy, your exhaustion, your envy, your exhaustion, your envy, your exhaustion, your anger at unfairness, your resentment toward people who had it easier. When you are far from growth, the shadow stays quiet. There's no threat. But when you move closer to becoming who you could be, the shadow panics, because growth means exposure, and exposure threatens every unresolved wound. So the shadow speaks. It says, "Others didn't struggle like this. The system rewards the wrong people. Talent matters more than effort. You're late to the game. You missed your chance." These thoughts feel factual, but psychologically, they are protective mechanisms. The shadow is not trying to destroy you. It is trying to spare you pain. Its logic is simple: if we quit now, we won't be humiliated later. Relief becomes the goal. Relief from uncertainty. Relief from effort. Relief from vulnerability. And quitting provides immediate relief. But Jung warned, what provides immediate relief often steals long-term meaning. Fulfillment requires integration, not suppression. Integration means you do not silence the shadow. You listen to it without obeying it. You acknowledge the bitterness, but do not let it steer. You recognize the resentment, but do not let it define reality. Because if you let the shadow make decisions, it will always choose safety over significance. And safety, over time, becomes suffocating. This is why people who quit often feel lighter at first and emptier later. They escaped discomfort, but they also escaped themselves. There is a phase in psychological development that almost no one prepares you for. The phase where meaning disappears. Not dramatically, quietly. The work you once loved feels dull. The dream that once energized you feels distant. The future you imagined feels strangely irrelevant. And you panic. You think something is wrong. But Jung saw this phase not as pathology, but as transition. Early motivation is fueled by fantasy. You imagine who you could become. You imagine recognition, freedom, transformation. Fantasy is powerful but shallow. Eventually, the psyche outgrows it. And when fantasy no longer motivates, meaning temporarily vanishes, this is the molting phase. The psyche strips away borrowed motivation so you can find something more authentic. Now, motivation must come from identity, not imagination. At first, you chase the dream. Later, the dream asks you to become something. And becoming is uncomfortable. It demands discipline without excitement, commitment without applause, effort without immediate emotional reward. This is why existential exhaustion often appears before success. Not depression in the clinical sense, but a deep tiredness of the soul. You feel hollow because the old reasons no longer work, and the new reasons have not yet formed. You are not broken, you are between selves, and that space feels empty because it is undefined. But emptiness is not absence, it is potential. The mistake is assuming emptiness means failure. Often, it means the psyche's clearing space for something truer. Jung rejected the idea that destiny announces itself with certainty. Destiny is not loud. It does not arrive with guarantees. It whispers. It appears as a persistent pull, a recurring theme, an invitation that refuses to leave you alone. And often it brings resistance, because destiny demands honesty, and honesty threatens comfort. If the path were wrong, it would feel irrelevant. But instead, it feels heavy. Your resistance is not proof you should stop. It is often proof that continuing would require shedding illusions. Illusions about who you are. Illusions about how life should reward you. Illusions about how much control you have. Destiny does not flatter the ego. It humbles it. So the ego resists, and you stand at the crossroads asking, is this wrong, or is this asking more of me than I want to give? That question matters, because many people abandon their path, not because it is incorrect, but because it outgrows their current self. The most dangerous sentence at this stage is not, I can't. It is, I can always come back later. Psychologically, this is rarely true. Because when you walk away, you do not just pause the work. You dissolve the identity that was forming around it. Identity is fragile in its early stages. It requires continuity. When you leave, something in you closes. Years later, you may return to the idea, but not to the same inner momentum. And this is why so many people feel hollow later in life. Not because they failed, but because they abandoned a becoming. They survived, but they did not unfold. Jung warned that unlived potential does not disappear. It turns inward. It becomes regret, cynicism, bitterness, disguised as realism. The tragedy is not that you didn't make it. The tragedy is that you never allowed yourself to find out who you could have become. They imagine applause, money arriving all at once, recognition that finally proves the struggle was worth it. But Jung understood something quieter and far more real. Making it is not applause, because applause fades, and then you're left alone again. It is not money, because money solves problems, but it doesn't resolve inner conflict. It is not recognition, because being seen by others does not guarantee you are at peace with yourself. Making it is something far less visible and far more rare. Making it is when your inner world stops fighting your outer effort. When you wake up tired, but not divided. When the work still feels heavy, but it no longer feels wrong. When struggle hurts, but it hurts in the right direction. There is a moment, quiet, almost unremarkable, when the constant inner resistance softens. You are still afraid, still uncertain, still imperfect. But the voice inside you stops saying, why am I doing this? And starts saying, this is mine to carry. That is alignment. And alignment does not feel euphoric. It feels calm, grounded, serious. It feels like suffering that finally makes sense. And here is the part most people miss, that alignment comes after confusion, not before it. Confusion is not a sign you are lost. It is often a sign that your old identity can no longer guide you. You must pass through disorientation to arrive at coherence. No one skips this phase. They only avoid it at great psychological cost. Listen carefully now, not with your mind, but with the part of you that's exhausted. You are not weak for being tired. You are tired because you have been carrying something meaningful without validation. No applause, no reassurance, no guarantee it will work out. You kept going anyway. That takes strength. But strength does not always feel strong. Sometimes strength feels like heaviness in the chest. Like waking up without excitement, but showing up anyway. Like continuing even when you don't know how this ends. If you were truly on the wrong path, you would feel bored, not burdened. Boredom is indifference. Burden is investment. Boredom means nothing is at stake. Burden means something precious is on the line. You are not tired because this is meaningless. You are tired because this is meaningless. You are tired because it matters. And that distinction changes everything. Quitting is seductive. It promises relief, rest, silence, and for a short while, it delivers. The pressure lifts, the anxiety fades, the inner conflict quiets. But then something else arrives. Emptiness. And that emptiness slowly turns into a question you can't escape. What if I stayed? Jung warned that unlived potential does not disappear. It turns inward. It becomes bitterness disguised as realism, cynicism disguised as wisdom, a quiet resentment toward those who dared to continue. Not because life was cruel, but because the soul was ignored. Quitting does not end pain. It postpones it, and often deepens it. Do not demand clarity right now. Clarity is a reward, not a prerequisite. Demand continuity. Do not ask, will this work? That question is too large for this moment. Ask instead, can I stay honest today? Can I show up without pretending? Can I do the next small thing without abandoning myself? Can I continue without needing certainty? Just stay. Stay curious when answers don't come. Stay awkward when confidence hasn't arrived. Stay imperfect when comparison whispers you should quit. The psyche does not reward brilliance. It rewards loyalty to the process. And meaning arrives only after the psyche knows you will not leave yourself the moment it gets uncomfortable. You don't need motivation right now. Motivation comes and goes. What you need is permission. Permission to be unfinished. Permission to be slow. Permission to continue without applause, without reassurance, without proof. Because this exhaustion you feel, this doubt, this silence, this weight, is often the final resistance before the psyche reorganizes around a stronger self. A self that no longer asks for permission to exist. A self that carries meaning quietly. A self that does not need to be saved because it stayed. Don't give up now. Not because success is guaranteed. Not because failure is impossible. But because becoming who you are requires you to pass through this moment. And you are closer than your tired mind can imagine.